Welcome to episode 73. I'm Katie.
I'm Garrett.
And this is a topic that I've been meaning to cover for a real long time, like since probably May
of
last year.
Well,
Like part of it was that we had kind of planned out what our episodes were going to be through you starting maternity leave, and then we had already started recording maternity leave episodes. So like it was just like it got lost in the sauce kind of, and then we had like a bunch of guests on and whatever.
it gets away from you. Like suddenly you're like, oh my God, you know what I wanted to do?
Like truly, I think that's
Yeah.
why I like the spreadsheet that we started
Mm.
so much, because it keeps me at least focused on what I'm supposed to be doing.
And you don't forget, I mean, like how many topics that we've been like, yeah, we're going to cover that. And then we completely forget about it. And then it comes up 6 months later and we're like, oh shit, that's right.
And my hairdresser actually asked me about this topic because she started doing it and asked me, and she has ADHD and was diagnosed in like middle school, I think. And so she asked me about microdosing for ADHD. And I said, isn't that just taking acid? And she was like, yeah, but not so you trip. And I was like, okay.
And we've
So
like touched on this, I think, in like a tertiary, like with other topics like depression. We've touched on microdosing. We talked about ADHD and weed. So I feel like there's been like some somewhat related topics, but never really talked specifically about microdosing.
right. And it's been like real big in the news lately.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot, it's all in our show notes, but like there's a lot of studies that have been done more recently on this topic. But like I really didn't even know beyond like that it's taking like magic mushrooms or LSD what it would be. And I guess like in my head it's like in Forrest Gump where Jenny just like drops acid and like almost takes her own life because she's at rock bottom or whatever. Like I guess I just like, to me it's like taking acid is like going on a trip, the end, or
I
like
feel
taking
like
shrooms.
I've been taking acid because the cat tower behind you is violently shaking. And I
Can you see him?
yeah. Like you're talking to me and the blanket's like like I can see it shaking back and forth. And I have to keep being like, I'm not seeing things, right?
Is
Like
she in
that
an earthquake?
that cat tower is actually moving, right?
Yeah, I don't know what he's doing, honestly. He's
I don't
not
think
usually in that cubby, but I was
I don't think
holding him in between episodes and he leapt up there. So I don't know.
this is his form of protest, is just shaking the cat tower.
Shoving his head out the corner. Who goes there?
That was wild. I actually had a dream last night that somebody gave me shrooms, which I've never done.
I've never done them either.
I've been offered shrooms, but I've always been afraid of having a bad trip.
I've never been offered them, and I think that says a lot about me as a person.
Yeah.
That nobody's ever offered me them.
Do you? There's an episode of Modern Family where Phil was like, when I was in college, I started a group called the National Association of Responsible Cheerleaders. And Mitch was like, narc. He was like, yep. So Katie started the National Association of Responsible Cheerleaders while I was getting offered shrooms. Yeah, shrooms, like, it seems like, I feel like shrooms was always like the stepping stone between like weed and acid. But I felt like I was too high strung for mushrooms, and that I would be so nervous about having a bad trip that I would give myself a bad trip. So I was like, I'm just gonna avoid. I know, like, if I smoke weed, I know what the like there's there's like a term I'm thinking of, the with like that they use it for like different elements, the like the atomic life or the
The half-life?
yeah, that's the word I was looking for. I know like how long I'm gonna be affected by weed, and it's not
Mm,
like 6 hours.
yeah.
So the time commitment always freaked me out.
Yeah, and I know a group of people who were camping this past summer and like before they went camping were like, "Okay, who wants some acid for the camping trip?"
Nightmare.
And they all, I guess, took it at the same time. Whatever. Like, I mean, but
Nightmare.
camping's a nightmare to me to begin with. Um, and then to add in acid where like I'm already being touched by bugs that I don't like, and then you're gonna like make me trip. Like, absolutely not. Like the last thing I need is like the spiders from Harry Potter like infiltrating my tent. Absolutely not. I can't. Um
But you know what? That's important to know your limitations. And you know that all of those are like do not pass go.
yeah, they're the all of them are the firmest of limits for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um
I
but I
definitely
have
for sure would not be doing acid when everybody else was also doing acid. Like I would only be doing those things in very specific circumstances, and I would
yeah,
need sober people around to make
I
sure I
think it
didn't do
was a
something.
group of maybe like 6 people and one of them like
That's not
volunteered to
no, that's not
stay
enough
sober.
people. That's not enough.
Um
More than half of the people have to be on the ground. That would be one of my rules. I
I
would
mean
need
technically they were you don't actually fly when you take acid.
I
We should
just
start with that. It doesn't actually give you superpowers.
yeah.
Um, since I'm deep into binging The Boys, I have very serious questions about the possibility of taking temporary superpower medication, but that's not what LSD is according to the research I read.
It's not superpower medication.
Not yet.
Damn.
But so how would you define microdosing?
My understanding is it's a such a low dose that it like alters your brain chemistry without causing you to actually trip. Like it like
So
the dosage would be such that it is working but you're not feeling it working.
technically, a microdose of LSD or mushrooms is a dose that does not cause a hallucinogenic response, which is also called a subsensorium dose. But how much that is not does not have a standard like definition.
Right, cuz it would
So,
have to do with like your tolerance for those things, I would think.
um I don't even know that it's that actually. I didn't see anything in any of the research mentioning user tolerance. Um, and I think that's part of the appeal of microdosing is that you don't build up a tolerance, so you don't need to increase your dose over time.
Ah.
Like you would potentially need to do with like weed as you increase your tolerance and
Right.
then or you have to take a tolerance break, whatever. So it could so anyway, how large of a microdose is in dispute and that much is agreed on. It could be 1/5 to 1/20th of a recreational dose of those substances. So recreational doses are reported anecdotally and seem to be 2 to 3 grams of dried mushrooms as a medium strength dose of psilocybin, which is the hallucinogenic property in a magic mushroom that causes the hallucination. So a microdose of that would be zero point 0.3 grams. But then again, the potency of mushrooms varies greatly outside of a clinical trial. So that
Right.
anecdotal evidence is even less reliable because there's no way to ensure that each person is taking shrooms in the same dose to begin with
Right.
to like end up with their microdose amount.
See, I don't know a lot
Um,
about shrooms. I'm wondering, like, different, like different genuses and species having different strengths, because like in theory you could have them in like capsule form, um
Yeah,
which
you could.
would help make them a little bit more consistent. But
Yes.
still, I mean, that's it. I mean, I feel like it would totally vary, or like probably what you're trying to treat would vary how much you need.
Um, we'll get into it
Oh, okay.
because
I'm ready.
maybe.
I'm ready.
Um, so overall, though, microdosing is like a general term that refers to taking small doses of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, um, or LSD, which is colloquially referred to as acid. Um, and you're taking that as that subsensorium dose. If you don't know, LSD is an invisible, tasteless, odorless substance that usually comes in liquid form or is embedded into a piece of paper that's slipped under the tongue like a Listerine strip. But I wrote, instead of having minty breath, you can breathe fire. Um,
Well, now we know what Katie would be thinking about when she tripped. Breathing fire.
yeah. If you're not going to become a dragon when you get superpowers, why bother? You know?
It kind of goes back to when we were talking about House of Dragons, and you and my spouse were both like obsessed with the dragons on that show. And I was like, I tell you right now, if I'm watching it by myself, I'm fast forwarding through the dragon scenes because I'm completely bored by it. And you were both horrified at that
Yeah.
fact. Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
anyway. Um Garrett hates animals, I guess, whatever. Uh
Animals. A fantasy creature.
Still an animal.
Yeah.
They'd live in the reptile house at the zoo if they were real.
I guess they would. Yeah. I guess they would.
So we talked about, like you mentioned earlier, we talked about this treatment option back in your depression episodes, which is episode 49
We're talking about
for
ketamine.
yes. And you did briefly mention like LSD.
Mhm.
But microdosing is becoming popular because doctors and patients have been interested in its potential for long-lasting improvements to mental health for people who are suffering from hard to treat conditions like treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and potentially ADHD. So, historically, substances identified as psychedelics have a long history of use by indigenous groups in the Americas and Turtle Island areas, including the Mazatec, Huichol, Shipibo, Maya, Olmec, Zapotec, and Aztec societies. One study I found noted that the Mazatec people, who were indigenous to Mexico, or what is now Mexico, had a well documented practice of using large doses of psilocybin containing mushrooms, but had also had a documented history of using microdoses of those same mushrooms to, quote, support the healing of physical conditions and emotional states such as sadness, anger, envy, isolation, and agitation, unquote.
Damn.
Yeah, so they were fully using this as what I would say like medicine.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I also thought it was interesting that they're using it to treat anger and envy. Um, because I think those, like, I don't know what the envy would be like that needed treatment. But I also think the idea of treating isolation like social anxiety
Oh,
um
yeah.
would be, or depression where you kind of like cloister
Right.
yourself, is very interesting. So in Europe, actually, mushrooms, nightshades, stinging nettles, and other ingredients with active substances were added to beer from the Middle Ages until 1516 when the Bavarian Purity Beer Act stopped that. I know.
Way to go, Germans.
I know. God, they ruin everything.
What a buzzkill.
That's
Like,
why Krampus has
literally.
to come and attack them every year. Yeah, I knew
Krampus
we'd
was
find the
like,
reason eventually.
they were like, how do
Uh,
we enforce this buzzkill rule? Krampus.
I feel like I don't know anything about stinging nettles, but, like, I feel like that would make my tongue numb if I was drinking that in beer, and that's probably not what stinging nettles do, but,
I've read about them, but, like, a lot of information I read about it and then forget, so at some point, Garrett knew about singing nettles,
cool.
and then, forgot it.
That's fun.
Yep. Tune in for more, things that I've learned and forgotten.
Tune in for more almost information.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Sounds about right.
So, this practice is still done combining psychedelics with other mood altering substances like beer or cacao, and it's called stacking. So that's still done today, even within like modern microdosing practices.
Yeah,
Um,
so, like, putting it into tea type?
into tea or like you put your LSD onto a thing of like a cube of dark chocolate and um
Ah.
yeah.
That's definitely a good way to get me to do it because I can hardly do liquid Dayquil without making a big
Well, we know
thing
what
of
I do with the weed chocolate. So,
all I can think is when you were like, "Can I have some more?" I'm like, "You sure about that?"
you
You're
sure
like,
about
"Yeah,
that, pal?
yeah." I was like, I don't know." "Yep, yep, I want more." I was like, okay."
The only downside was that we were in a pool and I was so fucking thirsty and couldn't drink the water. That was the only downside to that experience in my opinion. Uh and then I think the upside was infuriating the other person we were with my
I think it's a
inability
good
to move
example of macro dosing.
with 10 milligrams.
Yeah, that was a macro dose for sure.
uh Cut to me texting you being like, "I just saw somebody take an 80 milligram edible and then another one."
I would die, like,
Yeah, I
without a
almost
doubt.
died just watching it happen, so
I just can't even I can't even wrap my head around that, how much I would not be able to handle that,
I
especially
mean,
now.
fair. So, there used to be a ton of research into psychedelic use which found beneficial effects, but then there was a 40-year pause on that research once those substances were banned in the US. Like most things, um, you know, things get ruined by the Reagan administration. Um, Despite the ban, the more limited modern research has found some potential for using LSD and psilocybin for treating alcohol and tobacco dependence, depression, and end of life anxiety, along with research on methylene dioxymethamphetamine, aka MDMA, which has shown promise for treating PTSD. Psychedelics have been posited as a good option for treating these conditions because they can increase openness and create a mystical type experience in the brain when used in a healthy and controlled setting. And I think this is where the tie in to your EMDR and brain spotting episode um, is important because I think the idea, like you mentioned with your ketamine treatment in episode 49, not your ketamine treatment, but like
Ketamine treatment in general.
right, that having this with somebody who's like a trained mental health professional to like walk you through it, and if your brain is more open to discussing a traumatic event or what is inspiring your anxiety or depression, then you can probably maybe get to that root cause of it and address it rather than it being kind of like buried and you're like, I don't know, I just have a problem with crowds, or I don't know, I just have a problem with loud noises. And you're when you're like sober, your unwillingness to kind of like open that door and see what's behind the
Yes.
door, if you have the ability to open that door and face it, then perhaps you can improve your PTSD or depression or anxiety or whatever.
And I do think, like, and we talked about this in the weed episode, one of the, like, more therapeutic things that I have found about weed, especially during the pandemic when I just had a lot more time and
Mhm.
I would smoke and, like, go for a long walk. I did find that it did help, like, almost, like, open my thinking, so I was able to make connections and have clarity on things. And I don't know if it was so much that I had other brain noise going on
Mm.
like, what the specific root cause was, but I definitely had the ability to I would say this was I mean, like, before I went into therapy again, I was able to, like, get some clarity on things, make some connections, and have a deeper understanding of some things. And I had that, like, notepad on my phone where I would just, like, make
Mhm.
these notes of, like, connections and clarity and, like, understanding that I had on things, which kind of allowed me to, like, "Okay, I get it, I understand it, and now I can, like, digest it." So it helped me, like,
Mhm.
process a lot of stuff, and I think it was, like, super helpful in ways that, like, I couldn't have done with my normal baseline brain,
Yeah,
fully unmedicated
that's
brain.
fair. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel that way, like, that's what Lexapro did for me when I first went on that
Mhm.
when I was dealing with my PTSD, is that, like, it gave me that ability to, like, take a breath and assess
Yeah.
and, like, have that beat where I'm like, "Okay, what am I actually like, why am I feeling this way? Like, why am I feeling overwhelmed or panicked or, suffocated or whatever?" And, like, gave me the ability to take that beat and think it through and process it. Um, Whereas before, I was just all panic all the time and no
Yeah.
disco. And
That was good.
um So, some studies have shown that full dose psychedelics have provided relief of severe and chronic psychiatric conditions like extreme depression, anxiety, or PTSD. But that's not saying, and the studies were very clear, it's not saying that all depression, all anxiety, or all PTSD needs to be treated with psychedelics.
Right.
So, kind of like, again, in your depression episode, you were talking about like ketamine for treatment resistant depression, not just like, let's jump to ketamine every time you're feeling a little down.
But, I mean, we
Um,
struggle not we, but, like, societally, we struggle to get some people to take antidepressants.
mhm,
So, if you can't get people to take a very common,
mhm,
safe, well-documented SSRI, you are for sure not gonna get people to microdose.
right. Or I think one of the appeals of microdosing is that it's, especially if you're dealing with some paranoia, one of the appeals is that it's not regulated by the government, so the
It's
government
true.
can't be
No
meddling in
big
your
pharma.
medicine.
Yeah.
Right. Which, like I understand those objections to big pharma, to medication. I don't think that they're necessarily wrong. Um, but, like, let's not go down the QAnon slide,
Right.
for, you know, not trusting pharmaceutical medications. Because I know I've said it before, but, like, your doctor isn't trying to hurt you
No.
with prescribing a medication. Um, so, like but if you are suspect of pharmaceutical companies, then perhaps you will be willing to try microdosing as a treatment option. Um, but you can't really try that in a controlled setting because it's not regulated by the government. So you end up in this kind of in between spot where you can end up in a really dangerous situation taking something that isn't what you think it is or isn't what you were told it is. Um, so if you are doing this, please be careful. But the use of full dose LSD or psilocybin for severe conditions has resulted in the question of whether smaller doses that do not cause the hallucinogenic effects can be used to treat less severe mental health conditions. So, a microdosing regimen is not a set dose or frequency. It depends on the person. And since magic mushrooms and LSD are just illegal. There's no official dosing schedule. So it's not even like, oh, it's a controlled substance. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing. There's
Yeah.
no official guidance from like Johns Hopkins or like the Mayo Clinic
Which
on.
is so frustrating because it's like I don't know, why can't we have some less traditional treatments of things?
Well, and I think it's reasonable also, like I think it would be more responsible for those research institutions to say like, look, these are still illegal and these are dangerous. They shouldn't be used without like proper medical oversight or whatever. But if you're going to use them, this is like what studies have shown is an appropriate dose. Um, and like these are precautions you can take to make sure that you're doing this safely. And like just like there's naloxone at pharmacies and in some vending machines now, um, having that kind of information available from like a credible source where like
Right.
it's research back and it's not just like some guy on Reddit, um, I think would be helpful and I think would increase the conversation, like honest conversations with your own doctor about these types of behaviors. Because I think to an extent, like there's still a certain amount of shame going to the doctor and being like, oh, yeah, by the way, I do this illegal substance like pretty regularly, but only in microdoses. Like, I don't know how many people are really actively admitting that to their primary care physicians.
I definitely don't mention anything in any of my official documents about ever having been a pot smoker because it's not federally illegal and I just feel like we're I don't know, I don't like
Well, and to an
it
extent,
being
like
on the
how much
books.
do you just not want to get lectured?
And that, yeah.
Yeah. Like, oh, smoking's bad for you. Yes, I know. Like,
Yeah, I know.
yeah. So I think there's also that too.
Yeah.
And that's fair. But I would, if I were to have like my druthers about this, I would like to see that kind of information being available from reputable research institutions just
Yes.
so that it's out there. Like, hey, if like it's the kind of thing that you see with these harm prevention bills that allow folks to come in and use clean needles. Like they're not going to provide you with the drug, but they'll provide you with clean needles and sterilized equipment and a space
Right.
to take your drug and get high with medical people around in case you overdose or whatever. And they'll have resources available if you decide that you want to explore your help options to get off of a substance abuse cycle. But the studies around those clinics are really good and they show that there's a significant decrease in harm,
Yes.
both in the spread of disease and the incidences of overdosing because it also
Yes.
they give you an opportunity to test your drugs and do so safely.
Mhm.
And it it is what it is, but in any
And I
event.
wonder how addictive, or the addiction rates among hallucinogenics versus something like an opiate, which I feel like has probably a way high. I mean, this is like talking out of my bum again, but I feel like the addiction rates with things like opiates are so much higher. You don't hear about people going to rehab because they're addicted to hallucinogen like acid. You hear people going to
No.
rehab because they have, they have an alcohol use disorder or they're abusing opiates or you know, pharmaceuticals or, something of that nature. It's usually I just wonder how addictive um things you would be using for microdosing even are.
Well, and I don't have an answer, but I think the reason that I don't have an answer to that question is because we haven't been studying it for at least 40 years.
Right.
And because it's been illegal for at least 40 years in the US, we don't. And, I think also LSD or mushrooms, they're a party drug, right? So I
Right.
don't think that they're used in a vacuum. I think if someone's going to rehab, they might list LSD or mushrooms as one of the things that they use.
With
But
100 other
yeah,
things at
like
the same
with
time.
cocaine, with oxy, with
Right.
whatever. And so there's other stuff going on. And so to measure the addictiveness of a hallucinogenic substance, is kind of difficult because it's not in a vacuum, and it's not
Yes.
just like some people only use alcohol or only use heroin. Um, so it's not so cut and dry, I think.
Mhm.
But anyway, because the dose there's no official dosing schedule, the microdosing schedules are kind of made up. One of the more popular ones I found was 1 day of dosing followed by 2 days of not dosing. But how long you follow that dosing schedule is extremely variable. Some people do it for just a week, whereas other people do it for several years. Um, One study I found had mixed results among 278 microdosing participants and found that 26.6% of the participants reported improved mood, 14.8 reported improved focus, but also 18% reported physiological discomfort and 6.7% reported increased anxiety with their microdosing schedule. So the I also found a placebo-controlled double-blind study, and that had even less positive overall results. I mean, looking at that other study, 26.6% of the total participants reported an improved mood, meaning that 74.4% did not report an improved mood.
Right.
So 3/4 of the participants were like, "Meh,
Yeah.
no difference, no change, whatever." Um, but either way, the placebo-controlled double-blind studies had less positive overall results, and low doses of LSD have been reported to have the opposite of the intended effect, and can exacerbate depression and other conditions. Which is why we need more studying on it because we're not clear, like, is acid bad, but psilocybin is fine? Like, because those I mean, like, with your body chemistry, it matters. So there was actually a local to us report in the local news that, like, I stumbled upon looking at the weather. Like, I was trying to find, like, the traffic and weather report and then saw this. So, like, go figure. But, it followed a woman named Peggy Vandeplash, who used to be a banker and venture capitalist and said that her mental health was really bad, and then the pandemic made it even worse. But she's used microdosing to boost her productivity, mental clarity, and decrease overall feelings of anxiety and stress. She said in the article I read that microdosing improves your focus, creativity, and overall total productivity, and was also quoted as saying, "You're going to see solutions and opportunity where others don't see them. It really gives you a nice edge in your career, but also because you're way more relaxed, your mood is way more uplifted, and you have a better relationship with others." What do you
Mm.
think of that?
I mean, I can definitely see I think because of my experience with weed, I can totally see that being the case. Um, where and I think some of it is just like a trickle down effect. Like if you're less anxious, your ability to think creatively, your ability to have better interpersonal relationships, like those are all going to be improved if your anxiety is less and if
Mhm.
you're feeling less depressed. Like, that causes other areas of your life to improve. So, I mean, yeah, I can totally see how if you're doing something that's improving your anxiety or reducing depression, like an SSRI, like I will say being on an antidepressant, like, yes, I probably have better interpersonal relationships
Mhm.
because I'm not feeling like a rattlesnake all the time holed up in my house.
Yeah.
So,
That's what I my note on that was I think it actually just helped her depression, and maybe she had
yeah,
some ADHD
right.
that was exacerbated by the pandemic and with the increased anxiety of being locked inside for months on end.
Totally.
Um, I don't know, so, like, my critique of this woman's take is that she's, like, kind of offering microdosing as, like, a productivity aid, and,
It's almost like a cure-all that she's
yeah, like,
advertising
you
it.
can be more productive in your career, and you'll be able to, like, look outside the box and be more creative, and I don't know if we can really call that more productive if you're just less depressed, so you're struggling less with executive
Right.
functioning things or doom spiraling. So cuz the headline to this article was, "Can psychedelics make you more productive at work?" And so, like, obviously it's kind of like a clickbaity title, but
Right.
that was also this woman's kind of argument. I guess she's written a book at this point, because she's no longer a venture capitalist, whatever. Um, but I think to bill it as a cure all and say like you'll be more productive and this will put you ahead in your career.
You'll be
It's like the
creative and you
same.
won't be depressed and you won't
Yeah,
be
like,
anxious
first of
and
all, lady, you walked away from your career, so how do you know it's making you better in your career? You
right.
started a whole new career.
Yeah.
But so my point, to our listeners is like, if you see headlines like this, just like really read the article and see what it says.
Yeah.
And also, if you are tired, you can save the article and come back to it later. You don't have to read it and try to digest it right now. Um, which like it just occurred to me like as I was reading the article because like I skimmed it initially and then I had to go find it because I managed to read it and be like, wow, that's really interesting, and then not send the link to myself. So like it was the kind of thing where I was like, I probably just shouldn't have read it in that first moment and should have just sent the link to myself. So like just read like save it for later for when you're not overwhelmed or burnt out or just tired. Um but that being said, I'm glad that she's found some relief from what was weighing her down
Oh,
and that
for
she did
sure.
that through microdosing. Um, so the critiques of microdosing though are like pretty fair, I think. Um, the some researchers have said that people who swear by microdosing could be experiencing quote an expectancy effect, which is basically like a placebo effect. Like you take
Hmm.
the pill, you take this dose, and you expect it to make you feel better, and therefore you feel better.
Right.
Which is why that double blind placebo controlled study and those studies and everything we look at are so important because you can have this idea of like, wow, I really am feeling better. Like it must be the medicine I'm taking, not like, oh, maybe I just like have been eating more nutritionally lately, or I got outside and it's been warm out, so I got some vitamin D like synthesis, and I went for a walk this week, so like I just in general feeling a little bit better. Like maybe that's why I'm feeling better, not that I
Right.
microdosed. Um but a double blind study published in Translational Psychiatry and the Nature Journal found noticeable subjective effects, meaning the participants who were receiving the doses felt more creative or happier, but those self reported effects could not be supported by an actually objective, mm, could not be supported by an actual objectively enhanced well being, creativity, or increased cognitive function. The study then concluded that the anecdotal evidence that people rely on as proof that microdosing is great for you is not as reliable as they want to believe it is.
So this is very similar to like the weed episode where we were
Mhm.
talking about like, hey, if something's being advertised as a cure all, you can't trust that because nothing is a cure all.
Right.
And people being like, "Oh, it, cured my depression and my bones don't hurt and
Yes.
this." Like,
And the same with the essential oils, like,
right.
you know, and it's that thing where it's like, are you just feeling better because you're giving yourself a chance to rest?
Right.
You know?
Which like either like ultimately if it's doing those things for you, excellent.
Mhm.
Like even if it's a placebo effect, you're feeling better, you're functioning better, go for it. Um but I think to I think you kind of take away, like, the work that you're doing if you're giving all of the credit to a mushroom.
That's fair. That same article, from that local source, also interviewed someone from the FDA, and they mentioned that the current discourse around microdosing is emphasizing promises about treating depression, ADHD, and PTSD, but also noted that we used to think that medical marijuana could cure PTSD and depression too, and that opioids could be used as a risk-free way to manage chronic pain. And we found out that pot can't cure PTSD and opioids are highly dangerous. So we need to give, basically, this guy was like, we need to give scientists and researchers time to study microdosing in a clinical
Right.
setting and actually measure the results before we jump to treatment conclusions. And I think that that's fair. And that's basically what you were saying. I think
Yeah.
it's very easy to assume that, oh my God, this is it. And especially with, I think, a l- I mean, I think white people especially are like, this is an ancient remedy. And, indigenous groups have been using these for millennia, and therefore it's like this old wisdom that we just haven't tapped into yet, and thus it's kind of like beyond reproach. And it's the sort
Yeah.
of thing where it's like, well, what am I supposed to say? Like, an indigenous group used this to treat these things, like, I don't know, like, no shade, but they also used to like sacrifice people to the sun, and like, I don't know, did it work out for them? Jury's out. Like, but it's just like one of those things where I'm like, I guess, like, but it's also putting a lot of pressure on these indigenous peoples and these societies where they're like, we didn't ask you to apply this to everybody, and like,
Right.
who knows? And granted, I didn't read any of that information about the Mazatec people. Like, I didn't read the original sources, but, like, it could have been like, "Oh, if this person hasn't left their hut in 6 months, this is what we give them." Like, it could have been something where they're like, "We have, like, certain, like, you have to hit certain depression milestones before we're like, 'Hey, take some LSD or take some psilocybin.'"
Well, and they didn't have the ability to do double blind studies. So it's
Well,
like,
right. Yeah. And
if we have the ability now, and I think that's what is a little frustrating about the some of the bureaucracy surrounding some of these drugs
mm,
is once the government decides something is a schedule 1, like
yeah.
there's no learning about it.
Yeah.
So it sucks because, I think there's a lot of people that probably could benefit from it, but because we won't study it, there's no traction. Like you can't
Yeah.
make any headway on it. You can't develop safe practices for people. You
Right.
can't develop dosing. You can't develop a way for health insurance to cover it. Like it's just really it's too bad that we can't invest more time and energy into it to make it safer and accessible to people.
Mhm. No, I agree. And then I found this story. Um, on October 25th, 2023, an off-duty commercial airline pilot for Alaska Airlines was accused of trying to dismantle the plane's engines mid-flight and told investigators he believed he was dreaming and admitted to taking magic mushrooms 48 hours prior to the event.
I'm sorry, 48 hours?
Yes. So this this is why when you were talking about Half-Life earlier, I was like, "Ugh." We'll get there. So, in addition to taking magic mushrooms 48 hours before this event, the defendant also told police he had been awake for 40 hours. Apparently, the defendant believed he was dreaming and was pulling the handles of the fire extinguishing system, which cuts fuel to the aircraft's engines, because he thought that would cause him to wake up. Because he was at the time an off duty pilot, the defendant was riding in the cockpit in the jump seat, like in Catch Me If You Can, like where they like park him right behind the actual pilot on flying the plane. And he was basically tackled by the on duty pilot in the cockpit as he was trying to pull the handles down. And they stopped him before he could complete pulling the handle down. But he was like halfway through pulling down this cut fuel handle. Um, and so they
So
were
I have
able
to
to.
add this to the list of my intrusive thoughts now.
No,
But will I? Yeah. Oh
Oops.
god.
According to an article, they interviewed a Johns Hopkins professor who studies psychedelics and other drugs, and he opined that the psilocybin would likely not still be in his system after 48 hours, but it's possible he was feeling lingering effects of the drug, and that the drug, like, hangover basically that he was suffering, plus his existing depression and ongoing sleep deprivation converged and made this, like, perfect storm situation where he was experiencing behavioral changes or, quote, derealization, unquote. He was charged in federal court with interfering with a flight crew and charged in Oregon State Court with 83 felony counts of attempted murder, 83 counts of reckless endangerment, and 1 count of endangering an aircraft. The
Oh,
attempted murder
shit.
charges, I believe, were dropped, but he has pled not guilty to the 83 counts of reckless endangerment and is currently free on release pending trial as of December 7th. So,
That's nuts.
yeah, super nuts. So, and it's that thing where it's like, yeah, technically, I guess it's like you're, but the Johns Hopkins professor, which they like didn't call him doctor in the article, which is why I was like, I'm not naming him because I don't know. I'm assuming he's got like at least a PhD if he's a research professor, but
We've really been laughing really hard about that clip from Brooklyn Nine-Nine lately,
what one?
where it's Holt is helping interrogate that guy who's a dentist. And he's like
They're not real doctors.
and then it cuts off where he's talking about a PhD. It's literally describing a doctorate. He's like, and don't even get me started on etymology. And it like cuts off and he's like, apparently that's a trigger for me. So this poor guy's probably got like his PhD in something and he's got a doctorate.
Yeah, he's got more degrees than a thermometer, but they won't call him
And
doctor.
this article's like some jack off from Johns Hopkins was telling us about, yeah, he's an expert on psychedelics or something.
I don't know. I stopped listening. But he was basically saying like you can have like a hangover from drinking. There's no reason
Yeah.
why you wouldn't potentially have a hangover from this. And from what I can tell, this pilot, this defendant took like a full dose of psychedelics. He did not take a microdose. So, I mean, that's a grain of salt, I guess, in this. But he
Well,
did take it 2 days beforehand, and I would think if it
right.
were me, I would think 2 days before, like, I'm good to
It should
go. It
be
doesn't matter
fine.
that I
Yeah.
haven't slept in 40 hours. Not sure what he's doing, like, what other bender he's on that he hasn't slept in 40 hours, but
Right. And that makes me wonder too, like, it's again, are you using this on its own? Or are you also like, I
yeah.
mean, because we're not
Well, if you're
studying it,
stacking and using all these other substances with it,
right? Or are
you
you
know?
on prescription drugs? Like,
Mhm.
what if something in the mushrooms interacts with, say, your sleeping pill that you're taking and it
Mhm.
impacts the efficacy of your sleeping pill and it disrupts your sleep? So it's like, I mean, because we aren't studying these in like a real clinical setting, we don't know about interactions like that. So
Mhm.
something like this could happen, which is like another point to like we need to be studying these things so that
Yeah.
people understand they have the full picture of what they're getting into. Um
Yeah. I really do. I understand why, like, I understand there being some barriers to doing research on Schedule 1 medications or substances. However, I think that the barriers to conducting research on Schedule 1 substances are extremely high and way too high to benefit anybody. And I think like I don't know where the government got the idea that researchers just want to get stoned or high and like party all the time. Like I don't like the idea that like every study is just trying to get drugs to people who want them is weird. Like that's a weird perspective to have rather than just being like, "Oh, we'll monitor this study."
it's a very like J. Edgar Hoover approach
Yes.
to law enforcement.
Yep.
Like what
That was such a good movie.
that was a good movie. Yeah, it was. It's like what do you think people are like, what do you think these researchers are doing?
Right. Well, and it's that thing I think also with like applying for approval to do these things, like you have your research proposal and everything, but it's like, yeah, this is my hypothesis. I don't know what the fuck I'm going to find because there's no fucking research. Like I have nothing
Right.
to base this hypothesis off of even. So, I don't know. Like, I don't know how much I'll need of this substance to, and maybe it's that kind of thing where it's like, well, we did it with, 3 grams per person of magic mushrooms, but we did it with this type of mushroom instead of lion's bane or like whatever. And so, you know, we got these results, but it's that sort of thing where it's like, well, if that wasn't enough, if that wasn't a high enough dose to get any results, what do you don't, if you don't have the like quote results of the study, then I feel like that the whatever the FDA or the DEA is going to say like, well, you don't need to study it again because nothing happened. And it's like, well, did nothing happen or did we just not have a high enough dose? Because like
Right.
if I take, you know, 12 milligrams of Concerta, I don't feel any better. But
Mhm.
if I take 32 milligrams, I feel a lot better and functional. So
Mhm.
like it's
And
that
that could
like
vary for each person. I mean,
exactly. And it's
it's your
yeah.
I mean, maybe tolerance does play a factor. Maybe your, other drugs that you're on or what you've eaten that day or
Mhm.
your
Yeah,
body
like
fat
where you are
percentage
yeah,
or
where you are in your hormonal cycle,
right.
like we know how much that affects your brain chemistry on its own.
Yeah.
So there's just so many different factors that like for me personally, after doing all this research, I haven't seen enough to like compel me to try it. Um I Harvard says while any medical or lifestyle decision is an individual's choice, assuming that you aren't harming anyone else with your choice, um, they highly recommend that you speak with your doctor and explore your decision to take psychedelics and see if there are any medical reasons why you should be cautious to avoid these drugs. It's critical to pay attention to the legality and quality of your product. You likely can't afford to get into legal jeopardy and certainly can't afford to poison yourself. And that's from the Harvard School of Public Health. Um,
Do you have a message for them, Katie?
Not this time,
Oh, okay.
but we already made fun of the Johns Hopkins guy.
Poor guy.
If you're already microdosing, like I said earlier, just be careful. Like it's not regulated by the government, so like you don't know if it's laced with something. I
I think
know
that's what freaks me out. Fentanyl.
yes, and I think you can get like free testing strips. At least I think in New York you can get them from the Department of Health.
Hmm.
And maybe the pharmacies have them. I don't know. But especially with the uptick right now in lacing drugs with fentanyl, like it wouldn't be something that I'm willing to risk. But also keep some doses of Narcan or naloxone on you if you're going to start using these things. And I would keep track of how much you take and when and in what form so that if you do decide to discuss it with your doctor and to say like, "Hey, I've been having some relief from these things that I've been feeling and this is what I've been doing," you can at least show, how much you've been taking and when, and that way your doctor knows what's going on. But that being said, like you said earlier, you don't discuss with your doctor, smoking pot. So I still think it's good even if you're not going to discuss it with your doctor to keep track of how much
For
you're
sure.
taking and when, just so
For
that like
sure.
you know.
Yes. And what you're
Um
feeling and
Especially
I
because it's
mean,
not an everyday thing to microdose. Like
right.
it's one day on, 2 days off, or like I think my hairdresser said she does one day on, 2 days off, then one day on, one day off, one day on, and then 2 days off again. So like, but it's like this back and where I'm like, I couldn't fucking keep track of that. Are you out of your
I
mind?
lost track of it while you were explaining that.
Yeah,
So
that's fair. That's like when you were
I'd be
talking
doomed.
about lack of focus and I forgot to pay attention. Um
What ADHD?
I cackled when I listened to that episode and that happened again. 'Cause you were like, "Wait, are you kidding?" Or like, "Are you
I
just
can't
fucking with me, Katie? You're kind
I
of a
can't tell if you're
bitch."
serious.
Also in Oregon, therapeutic use of psychedelics was approved in 2020. So if that's something you want to happen in your area, reach out to your local representatives and see if they can sponsor a bill. Currently, right now, there's a draft of a bill to allow therapeutic use of psychedelics in New York, but it's currently in committee. And I have no idea if that's anywhere close to getting out of committee. I know we have at least one listener who can give us information on that. So when you hear us, let us know.
Help
You know who you
us.
are. But, so I guess it's potentially I don't like, that was also mentioned in that local article, but it didn't mention, like, "Oh, we expect it to get out of committee." Like, I think it just I think it'll kind of flounder there and then just disappear into the abyss. Um,
Like a lot of things that they're
yeah, like,
supposed
New
to be
York
doing.
is liberal, but we're not that liberal.
And we also have a notoriously bad, like, state government. Like, notoriously corrupt, notoriously sitting on things and inefficient, and
Really good at installing lights, though.
don't even get me started. I just had a very I would say that we just had a micro sun installed outside of our house that shines directly onto the front of our house. So I sent Katie pictures because it looks like the sun is shining.
I told Garrett that it looks like she's on an episode of Cops where the helicopter is, like, following the person through people's backyards,
Yep.
and it's the helicopter light shining into her house.
Yes. It's like
It's
living
wild.
on the floor of a on the green of a football stadium.
Yeah, yeah, that is what it
That's what
looks
it's
like.
like. Yeah. It's been really
Um,
nice.
yeah, it's hard to not take it personally, frankly. I feel like it has to be very deliberate and personal.
That's what I said. My spouse was like, "I don't think so." And I was like, "I do."
I mean, I would say it and make them prove you wrong,
Yeah.
frankly. Like, at this point, you have nothing to
Yeah.
lose. Um,
Yep.
But, yeah, so that's microdosing. Um, the research that is out there is real dense, but, there's definitely a lot of forums, on Reddit and Facebook, I'm sure, about it. But
I
you're
would be
kind
interested to try it. I would try it.
Really?
I would try it when my child is a little bit older and less at the shit could go wrong so quick, so fast, out of nowhere age. And I would try like the babyest dose
Mhm.
of like mushrooms, like the babyest, just to see. And then, like, wait a couple days, see if I could find like a therapeutic. I'd be curious. I'd
That's
be
fair.
way more apt to do it if I wasn't taking antidepressants. But I feel
Yeah.
like that takes care of enough of my anxiety and depression symptoms that I don't really feel the need for
Yeah.
mushrooms,
And I
but
think this is also used by folks who, um, either can't get, um, medication through a pharmacy because they don't have insurance or have shitty
mhm.
insurance, or have treatment resistant, issues or have struggled with finding a, appropriate dose of a regular,
Mhm.
pharmaceutical medication, which I understand is, like, super disheartening and super depressing in and of itself to struggle with finding the right
Oh, yeah.
dose and finding the right medication because it can feel like you're just not getting better. And
Yeah,
it
no, I
takes
definitely
so
feel very
long.
lucky that
Yeah,
I have
same.
just been I found an effective dose, effective drug
Yeah.
from the start.
Right, and I understand how I empathize with how frustrating that would be to have to, wait 4 weeks, go back to your doctor, say, "No, I still feel like trash," and I'm, like, barely holding it together. "Okay, let's try a higher dose or a different med," and then you have to wait another 4 weeks, and, like, it's just a super long process. So I understand the appeal of doing something illicit like this if you can have positive results, even if that positive result is purely a placebo effect. Um, you know, if it gets you
Who
better.
cares at that point if you're feeling better? Yeah. I mean, like, I
Yeah.
know, my spouse and I had both started, like, an antidepressant around the same time, and I literally within, like, a week felt 1,000 times better. Like, I couldn't get over the
Mhm.
difference. To me, it was like, "Oh, look how clearly, this was a chemical imbalance that I took
Yes.
something as soon as I had, like, a blood level of it, I felt better."
Mhm.
Whereas my spouse, it took, like, 4 or 6 weeks for his to kick in, and was, like, so frustrated that I was like, "Man, I
Yeah.
feel great," and he was like, "This
Yeah.
sucks. I still don't feel good." Um, so that's frustrating in and of itself. So to have to try multiple medications and doses and, this trial and error period until you find something that works, and the reality is, like, over time, that may work for you now, but it may not work for you in 3 years or next year, or, you know, after taking it for a couple years, you may need to switch to something else. So, yeah, it's definitely like a fraught process. So I think really if it's something where microdosing is what's getting you relief and you feel more functional and less depressed and less anxious and more creative, like if what that woman said is true for you and you're having all these positive effects, then what harm is it causing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, like Harvard said, as long as you're not hurting other people in the process,
Right, and you're getting it from a
then
safe source
yeah.
and you're being careful, then I mean, why not?
And, keep it locked up so that kids can't get into it. Um,
Yeah,
I hope that goes without saying, but just in case, let's
yeah.
not end up on a Tide PSA.
That's so funny, I was just gonna say Tide Pods. But yeah,
But
that was interesting. But no, good job. That was fun. That was a fun episode.
thanks. Until next week, I don't know what the topic will be. Uh, but whatever. Um, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I didn't mean to say that like
Happy
happy birthday.
birthday.
I had another thought and then I was like, this isn't our New Year's resolution episode, so I need to stop focusing on New Year's resolutions. Happy New Year. Welcome 2024. Um, the sun is starting to come back. We're gaining daylight, so we've made it.
Mhm.
Um,
Drink
and
some
we're
water.
microdose some sunlight.
There you go. And microdose whatever your theme is for the year.
Ah, yeah. Like that. I like that.
Cuz the bar is ankle high.
Bye.
Bye.